In today's episode, we're out here taking a look at the recently refreshed Kia Forte. For 2017, Kia decided to give this vehicle a new nose, a slight tweak out back, and a new engine under the hood. Because it has recently received this refresh, we expect the 2018 model to be essentially the same vehicle. That's why this video is going to cover the 2017 and 2018 model years. We're also going to be covering the sedan and the hatchback, and the hatch is what we're driving right here. I'm really glad I was able to get my hands on the Forte this week, because this vehicle, I think, is the perfect example of two things. How far Kia has come in such a short time, really the last 10 years or so, in seriously improving their products. And it's also a perfect example of why it seems like every reviewer out there gives a brand new car an excellent review. Obviously, when a manufacturer designs a brand new vehicle, they don't want to design a vehicle that's merely class average. They really want to beat the competition in most areas. And that was what was going on back in 2014 with the Forte when this model was brand new. Back then, the Kia Forte compared very well with the Honda Civic of the day and the Toyota Corolla of the day. But this basic vehicle is now older, especially than the Honda Civic. And that is obviously going to affect the way that this vehicle stacks up to the competition. The main changes for 2017 include a new front end look. This now looks a little bit more like the Kia Optima sedan. We have this sort of cross-hatch pattern going on here in the Tiger Nose grille, and then new headlamp modules with an LED accent strip inside. Our model has fog lamps below, and then because we're in the turbocharged model, we have a red stripe down there on the lower grille. The front end is largely the same whether you get the sedan or the hatchback, but it does change a little bit right here around the fog lights. In addition to the exterior tweaks, we also get a new engine under the hood in the sedan, and we get some new active safety technologies available. The Forte is available as a compact sedan or a compact hatchback. So this is the direct competitor to things like the Corolla IM, the Honda Civic, and the Mazda 3. In hatchback form, which is again what we're looking at right here, this is 171.3 inches long, making this about the same size overall as a Corolla IM. As we see with most compact sedan and hatchback pairs, the sedan is a little bit longer. It's about 8 inches longer at 179.5 inches long, making it about the same length as a Mazda 3 sedan. Whether you're looking at the sedan or the hatchback version of the Forte, this is a little bit shorter than some of the newer entries in this segment. It seems like cars keep growing with every generation, so when Kia gets around to completely replacing the Forte, expect this to get bigger as well. In terms of overall profile, you'll notice that the Forte5, which is what they call the hatchback, has a slightly more classic hatchback profile than the new Honda Civic hatchback. The new Honda Civic hatchback really is more of a liftback. It has a very horizontal rear window, and that makes that vehicle overall a little bit longer and a little bit less practical when it comes to overall space efficiency. But we do find a little bit more cargo room in the back of that Civic hatch than we find in the Forte5. If you're torn between getting the sedan or the hatchback, you should know that we get not only 70% more cargo area in the back of the Forte5, but we also get 2 inches more rear headroom than we find in the Forte sedan. And that's even though this is 8 inches shorter. And that is logically why hatchbacks tend to be very popular outside the United States, but inside the US, people seem to prefer the sedan. Out back, we find LED tail lamps with an accent strip that circles around from the body on over to the hatch and then back to the body. Because we're in the turbocharged model, we have a TGDI badge right here and twin exhaust at the bottom of the bumper. Between the sedan and the hatchback, you find 3 different engines. In the LX and S trim of the sedan, we find the all-new base engine I mentioned earlier. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 147 horsepower, and new for this year, it can now run on an Atkinson cycle in order to improve efficiency. You'll find that mated to either a 6-speed automatic transmission or a 6-speed manual. Most Fortes you'll find on dealer lots, whether that's an EX or an LX sedan or an EX hatchback, will have a 2-liter direct injection 4-cylinder engine that produces a little bit more power than the base engine at 164. But today we're taking a look at the SX hatch, which has this 1.6-liter turbocharged engine producing 201 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. This is essentially the same engine that we find under the hood of the turbocharged Kia Soul. Instead of a 6-speed automatic transmission, this engine gets a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, again also shared with the Kia Soul, or a 6-speed manual. Today we're driving the manual transmission version. Depending on the engine and the transmission you get, fuel economy will range between 25 miles per gallon, which is the model we're driving right here because it's the most powerful, and 32 miles per gallon for the most efficient model. You'll notice that 32 miles per gallon is an improvement over the 2016 Forte, but it is still a little bit lower than some of the competition, especially those with continuously variable transmissions. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 7 out of 10 points. We are in essentially the top end trim, which is the SX Turbo, so we have a multi-way power driver's seat with a two-way adjustable lumbar support. In terms of overall seat comfort, this seat falls behind some of the newer entries of the segment, especially the brand new Honda Civic. The difference in seat comfort between this and the Civic largely has to do with the adjustability of the seat. This seat bottom cushion does not get terribly close to the ground, and that means that I found this driving position to be a little bit less comfortable than a lot of the competition. The result is that if you're a taller driver or if you have a taller front passenger, you may have troubles fitting in the vehicle. It also results in the overall driving position feeling a little bit upright compared to pretty much every other compact sedan out there. Out back, we find a surprisingly generous amount of headroom and legroom for a vehicle in the compact category. So this rear seat score goes up to 9 out of 10 points. Combined legroom is actually average for this category, although the rear seat does feel roomier than some of the competition with larger combined legroom numbers. One thing's for sure, however, we have an excellent amount of headroom. We are driving the hatch, which has an extra 2 inches of headroom versus the sedan, but I still have at least 2 inches of headroom left, and I'm sitting very upright in this rear seat. The extra headroom is really obvious if you move over to the middle seat, where my head is not touching the ceiling, my hair is not brushing the ceiling, as it would be in the sedan. If I move all the way over to the right side of the car, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, and my knees do touch the seat if I put them together. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, and they are almost completely flat with the cargo area in the back. Rear passengers get a center armrest with 2 large cup holders, and a nice touch back here is that the shoulder belt actually comes out of the seat back itself, not out of the ceiling. That makes it a little bit more comfortable for a center passenger, and it makes it a little bit easier to put a child seat right back here in the middle. At 14.9 cubic feet of cargo capacity, the Forte sedan is above average for the compact sedan category. However, if you want to carry more cargo, you will find about 70% more cargo room in the hatchback at 23.2 cubic feet. This is one of the largest cargo areas in the compact hatchback category, almost as large as the Honda Civic hatchback. Now, the key thing to know about the Civic's cargo area is that although it is larger, it is not as square as this cargo area. And that means that you can actually put more bags in this upright position in the Forte and still close the hatch, although you would have to remove this hard cargo cover in order to close the hatch. If you lift up the load floor, we find some additional storage. There's a divider right here and then one on each side of it. And if I were to lift this up out of the way, we do find enough room to put a compact spare tire aftermarket if you want to. However, there isn't one in this car by default. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the SX trim, so we have a power moonroof up there, height adjustable seat belts for the driver and the front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests, and this 2-tone red and black leather interior. Because the SX trim is the sportier trim, we have slightly more aggressive side and bottom seat bolstering than we find in the regular Forte. The front doors are made from a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. We find a lot of hard plastics lower on the door, especially around the storage cubby right here. We find a soft touch injection molded upper section, a soft touch insert that's not quite as soft as the upper section, and then a soft armrest right over here. Moving over to the dashboard, it's obvious that the Forte comes from a slightly different design generation than the other Kia models that you find on the dealer lots. The shapes and the material selections going on in this cabin are a little bit different than we find in the subcompact Rio or the midsize Kia Optima. On the passenger side of the dashboard, we find a soft touch injection molded panel. The other parts of the dashboard, the surround right over here on the passenger side and the lower and center sections of the dashboard, are all hard plastics. Below that, we find a large bin-style glove compartment, easily able to accommodate a large tablet computer. Moving over to the center of the dashboard, we find a digital clock separate from the infotainment system. This seems to be a holdover from previous generations of Kia products. We find some carbon fiber effect trim on either side of this optional 6.5-inch infotainment and navigation system. We do have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto support, although this screen is a little bit smaller than we find in some of the other Kia models. Models like the smaller Kia Soul offer an 8-inch touchscreen infotainment system. Below that, we find the controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control system, which is optional, and then a roller cover that hides a compartment where you can put your smartphone. There's also a 12-volt power outlet on the left, a 12-volt power outlet on the right, USB and auxiliary inputs right inside. Today we're driving the model with the 6-speed manual transmission. Again, a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission is available with the SX model. With this transmission, reverse is all the way over to the left and up, which is not my preference. I generally prefer manual transmissions where reverse is all the way over to the right and then down. On either side of this, we have the controls for the heated and ventilated front seats. Between the front seats, we find a handbrake, 2 large cup holders, and a small storage cubby. Behind that we have a padded center armrest which opens to reveal a moderately sized storage cubby with a little divider where you can put wallets or keys. The instrument cluster is very similar to what we see in other Kia models. We have black faces, white numbers, and red needles. And then between the speedometer and the tachometer, we have a color multifunction display. This display is where you'll find things like turn-by-turn navigation directions if you're using the vehicle's built-in system, audio system information, service interval information, and the ability to change vehicle settings. Vehicle settings are typically not done in the touchscreen infotainment system in Kia models. And of course, this is where you'll find your typical trip computer information and the option for a digital speedometer. Moving out from there, we have one of Kia's flat bottom 3-spoke steering wheels. We have these black trim sections right down here for those hand grip areas, and then we have sport grips up top. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the infotainment system, volume up, down, mute, mode button, and track forward, backward, as well as a voice command button and dedicated phone buttons. And then on the right side of the wheel, we find the buttons to control that multifunction display and the cruise control. Thanks to the turbocharged engine and the relatively light curb weight, we ran from 0 to 60 in this manual transmission model in 6.9 seconds. If you want to go faster 0 to 60, then you should get the 7-speed dual clutch transmission because that will do it in 6.4 seconds very repeatably. As always, manual transmission acceleration times really will depend on how good you are at shifting the transmission and of course operating the clutch, because driver error really is the biggest factor in 0 to 60 time. That puts this almost exactly the same as the brand new Honda Civic Sport, which has their more powerful 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. That may surprise you a little bit, but it's long been rumored that Honda underrates that 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. So I suspect in real-world terms it is actually producing right about the same kind of power that we find out of this 1.6-liter turbocharged engine. 0 to 60 times are very, very comparable whether you're taking a look at the manual transmission or the CVT in that Honda Civic versus the 7-speed DCT in this vehicle. Now, I would personally take the 7-speed DCT because it is much more engaging to drive than the CVT that we find in the Honda Civic. Thanks to the 225 width tires and the light curb weight, braking distances are quite short in the Forte 5 SX. We stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 115 feet. That's quite similar again to the Honda Civic Sport. But where this becomes different than the Honda Civic Sport is in the way the vehicle handles, specifically the way the vehicle feels while handling. Handling is actually fairly good in the Forte, comparatively, whether we're talking about base Forte models or this Forte SX. But the SX doesn't have the same kind of feel that we find in the Ford Focus or in the Mazda 3 or in that brand new Civic Sport. It's just not as engaging. It's harder to tell exactly what the front tires are doing. Another big factor when it comes to handling is that this does not have a fully independent rear suspension, and that really does hamper the handling ability in this vehicle, even when you compare this to something like a Toyota Corolla IM. The Corolla hatchback actually handles very, very well for this segment, very much like the Honda Civic. Now, the Corolla is not any more engaging than this vehicle because its steering is just about as numb, but the rear suspension definitely has a more elegant feel to it. It's most noticeable if you really start pushing the vehicle hard in the corners, especially on broken pavement. Because of the lack in feel, I am going to have to give the Forte a B when it comes to our overall handling score. The big reason here is that the Forte handles well, but it's a little bit difficult to tell exactly how far you can push the vehicle because of the way the suspension and the steering overall feel. Some of this again seems to have to do with the overall age of the Forte. Because back when the Forte was launched in 2014, it was very, very comparable to the current generation Honda Civic at that time, but the Honda Civic really has improved in its latest generation. Out on rougher roads like the gravel road that we're on right here, the Forte does a fairly good job of accepting most of the bumps in the road, although this suspension is obviously firmer than you'll find most Forte models or most models of the competition. That's logical, of course, because the SX trim is the sporty trim, so this is going to be a little bit firmer than your average Honda Civic or your average Toyota Corolla, but this is fairly equal to something like the Civic Sport. Now, if you really start pushing the Forte harder in corners, the ride quality does deteriorate just a little bit, because as I said earlier, this is not a fully independent rear suspension, so the rear suspension does become unsettled in corners. That does interrupt the ride quality. When it comes to overall ride quality, I'm going to give this a B-. This is not so firm as to become unlivable for daily commuting, but it is definitely, again, a little bit firmer than something that you want to take on a long highway trip. In our cabin noise test, we scored 72 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which makes this among the quietest compact sedans or compact hatchbacks. The cabin noise score is especially impressive for a compact hatchback because these are generally a little bit louder than a compact sedan because the cargo area is open to the passenger area of the vehicle, and that helps bring a little bit more noise into the cabin. In terms of overall fuel economy, we have been averaging 26 miles per gallon in this model, which is actually better than the EPA says we should be getting. However, depending on the trim of the Honda Civic you will get mid to high 30s in terms of overall fuel economy, especially if you opt for that continuously variable transmission. Now, it's not going to be as much fun as the Civic with the manual transmission or as this Forte with the manual transmission, but it is going to be more fuel efficient. The Forte 5 is an awful lot of fun to drive out on your favorite winding mountain road, and this turbocharged engine really is an excellent partner. The 6-speed manual transmission also is a pretty good model. The overall manual transmission feel is not quite up to the same level that we find in the Mazda 3 or the Honda Civic, but it comes surprisingly close. The shifts are fairly short, and the engagement and clutch pedal feel are pretty good. We don't have tractor-like levels of clutch pedal travel, and it's pretty easy to tell exactly where the clutch is going to engage. Now, that said, of course, I probably would buy the Forte with the 7-speed dual clutch transmission because it shifts quite simply faster than a human can, and that's why it goes from 0 to 60 faster than I can. Dynamically, the Forte is just not up to the same level as the current generation Honda Civic, but it does incredibly well when you compare this to the rest of the competition, because this may not be quite as engaging in terms of overall steering feel or in terms of overall suspension ability as the Mazda 3, but it is notably quicker 0 to 60. Especially if you get the 7-speed dual clutch transmission, this is going to get you to highway speed an awful lot faster than the Mazda 3, even with the 2.5-liter optional engine. Now, that said, this is not a Civic Si competitor, it's not a Volkswagen GTI competitor, or a Ford Focus RS or ST competitor, but then again, it's not really trying to be either. And it's really obvious when you take a look at the price tag. So let's dive on into that now. For 2017, the Forte starts at $16,600 for the sedan, $18,200 for the hatchback. I expect pricing for 2018 to stay substantially similar to 2017. That seems to be Kia's style. The Forte 5 SX that we've been driving this week started at $23,800, and the model we were driving was essentially fully loaded with the manual transmission. Interestingly enough, the manual transmission is not standard in the Forte 5 SX. It's actually optional, and the base manual transmission will be more expensive than the base model with the 7-speed dual clutch transmission. And that's because you have to add a few options in order to get up into the Forte 5 that would get the manual. Well, taking a look at this chart, it's worth noting that there is a bit more variance in terms of feature content between the same named trim levels of the sedan and the hatchback. So if you're looking at the EX trim, for instance, on the sedan and EX trim of the hatchback, the feature content is not quite the same. That's a little bit different than some of the competitors that have basically the same content whether you get the sedan or the hatch. And that content difference accounts for most of the price difference between the sedan and the hatch. So on the surface, it looks like the hatch is more expensive. It actually ends up being a very small premium when you factor in the fact that we get more equipment and the more powerful engine in all versions of the hatch. With that, let's move on to our key takeaways. Obviously, the Forte and the Forte 5 are some of the older vehicles in Kia's lineup, and that does show on the inside. The interior does not feel quite as premium, and it doesn't feel quite as modern as the rest of the Kia lineup. That's just the way things tend to work in the industry, of course. You can expect to see a new Forte coming soon from Kia, but not for the 2018 model year. It might happen in 2019 or so. In the meantime, that does mean that the Forte falls behind some of the main competitors in this segment that are newer. That moves us right along to the competition, and the first and obvious direct competitor is the brand new Honda Civic. Not only is the Civic a brand new model, but Honda has also sharpened their claws for the compact segment, and they're bringing us a variety of different body styles. We have a coupe, we have a sedan, and we have a hatchback, and a host of different drivetrain options. Honda has also decided to go all in on turbocharged engines, and really only the base version of the Civic sedan gets a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine. Just about every other Civic you see, including all of the hatch models, have at least a 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. The base turbocharged engine in the Civic is significantly faster than any of the naturally aspirated engines we find in the Forte, and it's almost as fast as the Forte 5 SX. If that's not enough power for you, then Honda does have a variety of different power levels available, from the sport trim of the hatchback on up to the Civic Si available in the coupe and the sedan, and of course the absolutely insane 306 horsepower Type R. Not only is there more power in the Civic, but handling and handling feel are also superior. The infotainment system is a little less intuitive than the one that we find in the Forte, but it still offers all the same functionality. Honda makes an excellent manual transmission, and I would rate their manual transmission better than the one that we find in the Forte, but the CVT that we find under the rest of the Civic lineup is just not as engaging as a traditional automatic, or definitely the 7-speed DCT that we find in the Forte 5 SX. It's also worth noting that styling overall is a little controversial, and the more power you put in your Civic, the more controversial the styling gets. Fuel economy is definitely a strong win for the Civic over the Forte. We did average several miles per gallon better in every version of the Civic over what we find in the Kia. Now, the Forte does start significantly less than a Honda Civic, especially if you're looking at those base trims. But if you configure your Forte all the way up, like the fully loaded SX trim that we were driving this week, then it gets very, very close to the Honda Civic. You're likely going to find a better discount on the Forte at the dealer lots than the Civic, but it is still going to have a relatively similar MSRP. Next up, we have the Mazda 3. Much like the Forte, it was tweaked in 2017 to bring it up to date. However, Mazda gave the 3 a more thorough refresh than Kia did with the Forte, and it really shows especially on the interior. Back when both models were launched, the Mazda 3 felt a little bit more premium than the Forte's interior, although we found a little bit more feature content in the Forte than we did in the Mazda. But fast forwarding to 2017 and 2018, it's slightly different. Thanks to the additional tweaks that Mazda made to the interior, it now definitely feels more premium than what we find in the Kia. Driving dynamics are obviously the big selling point for the Mazda 3. However, it's important to remember that driving dynamics and acceleration are not necessarily the same thing, and we don't find any turbocharged engines under the hood of the Mazda. Therefore, when you analyze the entire package and you take a look at the Mazda 3 hatchback and its overall fun-to-drive nature out on your favorite winding mountain road, you're probably going to have just about as much fun, and it's going to be faster in the Forte 5. Mazda is promising Apple CarPlay and Android Auto in their infotainment system. They claim that will also be retrofittable to previous generations of the Mazda 3 with the same touchscreen system. However, we haven't seen that software yet, and it does appear to be delayed. However, on the Kia's side, you will find Apple CarPlay and Android Auto inside the cabin right now. Overall fuel efficiency and interior and cargo room is fairly comparable between the Mazda 3 and the Forte, but I did find the front seats to be more comfortable in the Mazda. That extra comfort will of course cost you more because the Mazda 3 is going to start more expensive than the Forte. And as you start adding features and options to the Mazda, that price difference basically continues on up the food chain. Next up, we have the Chevy Cruze, which is available both as a sedan and a hatchback, just like the Civic and the Mazda 3. Although the Chevy Cruze is newer than the overall design that we find in the Forte, it actually does not necessarily feel any fresher inside the cabin. It's just due to the overall styling that we find in the Chevy Cruze. Now, the Cruze does have an excellent standard turbocharged engine that is very, very efficient. It's not as powerful as the turbocharged engine that we find in the Honda Civic, but it can rival the Civic in terms of average fuel economy. Both models handle well, but I think the handling edge does have to go to the Chevy Cruze. Overall steering feel is very comparable between the two models, however. Although acceleration is quite good in the base models of the Cruze, there really is no corollary to the Forte 5 SX. And that's because all Cruze models at this point in time use the same small turbocharged engine. There is an available diesel if you want excellent fuel economy, but don't expect greater performance out of that diesel. And that brings us along to, I think, the most direct competitor to the Forte 5 SX, which I think actually is the Kia Soul Exclaim. The Soul Exclaim recently got the same turbocharged engine and the same 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that we've been seeing under the hood of the SX. It may seem odd to compare a very boxy subcompact vehicle to a more traditional compact sedan or compact hatchback, but they're on the same dealer lot, they have the same amount of power under the hood, and they're actually more similar inside than you might think in terms of overall room. In fact, you'll actually find more headroom, more legroom, and more cargo room inside the Kia Soul than we see in the Forte hatchback, and that's likely why Kia is selling so many of the Souls these days. When you're comparing Forte 5 SX to Soul Exclaim, the Exclaim is going to handle almost as well. It's not quite as good as the Forte 5 because it is a little bit heavier. There's about 200 extra pounds inside the Soul, likely due to the fact that we find that optional large panoramic moonroof inside the Soul that we don't find in the Forte. That does add extra weight, and the overall boxy dimensions of the Soul. Obviously that means acceleration is going to be just a little bit slower in the Soul. However, we actually get a slightly more modern Kia interior in the Soul. It's definitely noticeable when you look at the infotainment system, which becomes an 8-inch color touchscreen infotainment system, and the overall design and materials that we find on the dashboard. My bottom line with the Forte and Forte 5 is that the car is getting just a little bit old. Some of you have asked why reviewers, myself included, tend to give every new car at least a passing grade. As I said before, the reality is that manufacturers don't design their vehicles to be class middling. They design their vehicles to be class leading. And that was definitely what we saw when the Forte was released several years ago. But that was several years ago, and this is now 2017, and we now have a boatload of brand new competition. That means that the Forte, while still an excellent vehicle, has fallen down several pegs when compared to those competitors. The Mazda 3 and especially the Honda Civic have continued to raise the bar in the compact vehicle segment. If I had to shop for a brand new compact vehicle today, my top two picks would be either the Civic or the Mazda 3. I think the Mazda 3 is overall better styled than the Honda Civic, but the Civic is definitely better to drive. However, I also have to say that the Kia Soul would be a very, very strong competitor. The Soul is going to be less expensive than the Mazda 3 hatchback, the Honda Civic hatchback, or the Forte 5 hatchback, yet you're actually going to find more interior room. And if you look at the Soul Exclaim, performance is going to be absolutely excellent. 0 to 60 times are very comparable to the Civic Sport. And that's exactly why I happen to own a Kia Soul. Admittedly, mine is the Soul EV, the entire opposite end of the Soul spectrum from the Soul Exclaim, but the same thing applies. It's a very, very well-rounded practical vehicle, and the interior is honestly one of the best in the compact or subcompact segments, however you really want to classify the Soul. And that's why my absolute top pick in this segment continues to be the Honda Civic, but the runners-up are definitely the Mazda 3 and the Kia Soul. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com so you can see what we're driving today. If you want to support this channel, head over to patreon.com and find us over there, and I'll see you next week.